Good morning, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of the AmCham KPMG Space Series. We're really delighted to have you all with us here today. It's an exciting morning for us. My name is April Palmerley, and I'm the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. I was fortunate enough to lead a mission on the commercialization of space to the United States with Pam Melroy, who I believe is on the call today, and our colleagues at Austrade. And it's great to see several of the companies who came with us on the call today, like Myriota, and also some of the places that we visited, like NASA JPL on the call. We have lots of space startups, universities, defense primes, aerospace companies, venture capitalists, mining companies. We have Jackie Carpenter from One Giant Leap, welcome. Embassies, we have someone from the UAE Space Agency, the ISS National Laboratory, a great audience here today. So I hope you all will participate actively by asking questions through the Q&A bar at the bottom of your screen. And if there's anything you want to share with the group, put that in the chat box. As I said, AmCham is partnering with KPMG on this series. This is part 2 of a 5-part series. And we hope you'll join us for additional ones in the future. Today we have a really fantastic panel. Let me introduce them briefly to you and then hand over to our moderator. Dylan Taylor is CEO and Chairman of Voyager Space Holdings. He's a global business leader and a philanthropist. He excelled as a Fortune 1000 executive and board member of national service firms. Dylan began his leadership within the space industry as a co-founding partner of Space Angels and is the founder of the global nonprofit Space for Humanity. Carissa Christensen is CEO and founder of Bryce Space and Technology. Carissa is an internationally recognized expert on the space industry. She serves on the World Economic Forum Global Future Council, the Advisory Council of the Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy, and the National Research Council Space Technology Industry Government University Roundtable, which advises NASA. Carissa is in Virginia and Dylan is in Denver, I should have mentioned. Chris Bashrizin is operating partner at Data Collective VC in San Francisco. That's an investment firm specializing in data-driven science and engineering companies. Chris was also the co-founder of Planet, a company providing global mapping of Earth from space daily. That's another one of the companies that we visited on our trip. It's incredible. He was previously a space mission architect at NASA Ames Research Center. Chris co-founded PhoneSat, a spacecraft built out of a regular smartphone that demonstrated that space was within reach of regular phones. And Peter Beck, CEO and founder of Rocket Lab. He is in Auckland, New Zealand. He's the founder and CEO of Rocket Lab, the company leading the global small satellite industry. It was founded in 2006. They build and launch rockets and satellites that provide access to space for organizations like NASA, the NRO, DARPA, the United States Air Force, and the commercial space sector. An associate professor in space systems, Peter led the development of the groundbreaking Electron launch vehicle, now the 4th most frequently launched rocket in the world. Peter also leads the satellite division at Rocket Lab, which is making it faster and easier to get the ideas of tomorrow on orbit today. So really breathtaking panel, very excited to hear from them. Jacob Hacker is going to lead the discussion today. He's a space industry account lead at KPMG, and he has supported clients with market analysis, strategy, and operating model development. He's recently been recognized as a finalist in the Australian Space Industry Awards for his work in this sector. Thrilled to have you all with us here today. Over to you, Jacob.
Thanks so much, April, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us from wherever you are. To start with, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land of which we all meet, and in my case today, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So in the last decade, we have seen the transition from predominantly government-led space missions to commercial businesses taking a leading role, with NewSpace companies building and operating a wide range of hardware in space. Just 2 weeks ago, many of you would have watched the first commercial launch of people into orbit, with SpaceX taking 2 astronauts to the ISS. More sectors and businesses are engaging in the sector and leveraging the data and services available for agriculture, financial services, logistics, and many more applications. We're seeing record investment in the sector, but we're also seeing the challenges with significant companies facing financial challenges recently. We do, however, expect the space sector to grow rapidly, being worth $1 trillion in the coming 10 to 20 years. And with this growth, the role and diversity of space businesses will increase. Today, we'll explore the potential of space businesses in the coming decade. What will the space economy and space businesses look like? How might they be funded and generate revenue? And what is the benefit of all of these companies to our day-to-day lives on Earth? So I'm honoured to be joined by these four amazing panellists. Carissa, Chris, Dylan and Peter, welcome. To get us started, I have a question for all of you. And as we look ahead to 2030, what is it that excites you most about the new space companies that we're seeing today and expect to see in the coming decade? And Chris, if I can start with you, please.
You said me, right?
I'm in Sydney.
Yeah, hey. So, yeah, I think it's, for me, you know, I'm a technologist at heart and I geek out over really cool technology. And I think what the human race is going to invent and accomplish in the next decade is going to be really mind-blowing. And so I think that's kind of what keeps me on the edge of my seat. And yeah, I think the things that we can do with that in the future, you know, we all watch a lot of sci-fi movies in this space community, and I just want to see all of that happen. So I'm waiting for us to invent some of the things we need to really get humans into space. So that's my answer.
Thanks, Chris. Carissa, what excites you most about the companies we're seeing? We might have you on mute, Carissa.
Three areas are particularly interesting to me. The first is the unexpected practical applications that will result from new satellite capabilities like those of Planet, thanks to Chris. Thinking back to when the US military deployed GPS satellites, no one envisioned at that point that they would transform industrial logistics or consumer transportation. Certainly no one was envisioning that they would facilitate Pokemon Go. So you think about satellite capabilities and the global imagery multiple times a day of the entire Earth, the applications that we'll see that arise out of that, new kinds of imagery, new kinds of telecommunications. I think that's very exciting. Second, suborbital commercial human spaceflight. The idea that in the coming years, thousands or tens of thousands or even more people could afford to take an, albeit brief, flight to space for what's now about the cost of a house, and with the success of those companies might become the cost of a car or the cost of a vacation. That's truly extraordinary, given that only a few hundred people have ever flown to space to date. And third, the new era of exploration enabled by and supported by commercial companies, and the environment that we're in, the ability to ingest and process massive amounts of data, the ability of the internet to engage citizen scientists and diverse researchers around the world will make lunar and Mars exploration even more fruitful and exciting than they have been in the past.
Thank you, Carissa. Peter, what's exciting you at the moment?
There's so much to be excited about, but I guess in taking a slightly different turn, I'm most excited about the point in time where the infrastructure layer of space becomes boring, where a rocket launch is boring, a satellite development is boring, and it's just an everyday thing. I think human exploration will never be boring, but at least the infrastructure layers in space, I think when we get to the point where it's no longer an event that a tremendous amount of people stop for, and I just receive a text message on my phone to say that there's another dozen satellites in orbit, that is when we reach a point in delivering infrastructure to space that will have a true revolution to everybody down on Earth.
Thanks, Peter. Well, I know you've got a launch coming up, so I hope that's not too boring, but maybe in the decade ahead.
We hope for boring launches. That's what we strive for.
And Dylan, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, Jacob, thanks for hosting this and thanks for having me. A lot of it's been said, but just maybe to underline one of the points that Peter just made is this focus on infrastructure. and I would focus or underline space-based infrastructure. I'm very excited about, the prospect of having a private space station. I'm very excited about things like space-based manufacturing, space-based power generation, space-based communication. Those are all the railroad tracks that we need to lay if we want to go deeper into space. So I'm very energized by that. And I'm seeing, for the first time, really, business plans that don't fully close in terms of the business case, but are getting closer and closer. And then when you have sort of benefactor capital that we're seeing with like Blue Origin, for example, very focused on space-based infrastructure. When Bezos deploys his capital, it doesn't necessarily have to pencil. So I'm very energized by what I'm seeing. And, we've only been, just to remind everybody, we've only been 400,000 kilometers into space. That's the deepest we've been, which, if you just look at the solar system is a blip. So we've got much further to go.
Thanks, Dylan. You mentioned lots of different infrastructure there, and that's just part of what we see as a space economy. We talk a lot in the 30 Voices report about how it might be $1 trillion in the years ahead. Can you bring to life for us what the economy is of space and how we might achieve such rapid growth there?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of paths to glory, so to speak, a lot of ways to win. Carissa touched on one of them, which is the whole, what I would call hyperspectral Earth observation category. I've written on this before, but the way I back into it is if you just look at the data sets that Google and Facebook have built and the monetization they've been able to get from those data sets, I think each company is now $1 trillion market cap or pretty close to it. And you think about a data set that, is always on, ubiquitous, measuring all different aspects of what's happening on Earth. And you imagine we have roughly an $80 trillion or did have an $80 trillion global economy. It's taken a hit this year. Can we make a global economy 3% more efficient or 4% more efficient if we have perfect information about commerce? And I think the answer to that is absolutely. We can probably make it a lot more efficient than that. So if you just run the math, that's $2 or $3 trillion of value creation just right there. So I think that's one area of value creation. I think certainly going back to the moon to stay and actually having a place that we can, in situ, take resources and really start to build some infrastructure there. That ultimately will lead to things like space-based commerce, space-based tourism. I think that's maybe just on the edge of 2030 to be realistic. I think it's going to be deeper into this decade before that happens. But I think that's a whole nother other category. So those would be two examples, but I think the most near term would be the Earth observation, data monetization.
Thanks, Dylan. And Carissa, in your first response, you talk a lot about GPS and satellite and how they benefit other industries on Earth. What is a space business to you? And is Pokemon or a logistics company now a space business as well?
So it's a really important question. What is a space business? And the answer is really dependent on the reason you're asking the question. If you are asking the question to understand the national supply chain that supports your defense infrastructure, space businesses are companies that manufacture and launch and operate satellites and relevant platforms. If you're asking the question to evaluate whether an investment in an R&D investment to develop a national satellite capability or an industrial sector is relevant, then every single business that sees its products and services enhanced or improved by satellites, to Dylan's point, every single business that benefits directly from that addition, those efficiencies, those constitute space businesses for that purpose. So it very much depends on the question. The workaday definition that we routinely use for our estimates of the space economy is to look at companies that use space assets as a significant part of delivering their products and services. And that actually is a fairly conservative definition. There are a lot of additional companies downstream. So I would argue that the space economy is almost always larger than we count it as because of all those other companies that are affected.
Yeah, it's really exciting, Carissa, and so many of the NewSpace companies we're seeing are really targeting all sorts of new technology across the sector. Chris, a question for you as a technologist, but also as an investor. We think about these new space companies being leaders of the sector in 10 years' time, but they might just be startups now. What do they look like to you?
Well, I mean, if I knew that, I'd be a really fantastic investor. So, I mean, that's really what I'm trying to figure out. I think just looking, at what we've seen historically in the new space industry is that a lot of innovations came from outside the industry. For instance, Peter Beck on the call brought a lot of innovations to rocketry, including lithium-ion batteries. I'm sure you can speak about that. I don't want to steal his thunder, but carbon fiber, 3D printing, all of those things were invented somewhere else. You mentioned the PhoneSat project that in the introduction, the PhoneSat project was mentioned. That was cool because that was launching a satellite that was entirely made out of cell phone parts. So I think this idea that NASA or the space industry invent cool new technologies, that's a reputation the industry's had for 60 years, well deserved. But actually a lot of investment goes into other things. And I think space could learn still a lot from taking those things that have been invented elsewhere and using them. And I think Rocket Lab is a great example of 3 or 4 different technologies that have come together to create a new kind of rocket that's cheaper and more reliable and more capable. So I think that's what I look for as well, is just new pieces of technologies that are surprising. You might be surprised that it works, but it's being used in space, and I think that is really transformative.
Thanks so much, Chris. And to everyone on the phone, the Q&A line is open, and we're starting to see a couple of questions, but do keep submitting those, and we'll get to them later during this webinar. Peter, Chris touches on some really interesting points there about the different technologies that we're seeing that are sort of spun into the space sector, but actually we need to make some technology breakthroughs to really make a few of these business cases sing, as Dylan started to mention. What are some of the technology breakthroughs that you think we need to see or would like to see in the coming decade?
Yeah, I'm less kind of resolved on a particular technology breakthrough, but I kind of reiterating Chris's point is, what is a space business? And to me, we're really in this era of the democratization of really what a space business is. Because I think the most successful space businesses in the future will probably not be even recognizable as a space business. And that's certainly something that we believe in very strongly here, and are trying to remove the barriers to not just to get into orbit, but also to get ideas and innovations on orbit. So I think excuse me, I think space businesses are going to look very, very different in the future. So, and I don't think it's one particular innovation. I think it's, as Chris was saying, it's repurposing a ton of other innovations to create opportunities that haven't been thought of before. And I'm in the same bucket as Chris on this one. I think the biggest space business has not even been conceived yet, and it's still yet to occur.
Thanks, Peter. Back to you, Chris. I know in the report you mentioned things like navigation and how we can improve control of spacecraft. Is there anything that really you think we need to solve in the coming decade?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's science fiction movies are really cool, but they kind of do the industry a disservice, because a lot of things that look easy in movies that we're used to, as someone working in the industry, it's kind of frustrating that we can't do it. So like Star Wars, for instance, there's a lot of cool things like that BB-8 robot that was in the first new Star Wars. We actually built that so that we could film it. So that's cool. That's a future technology that exists today. But if you think about, the original Star Wars with Luke, using his lightsaber, training against a floating ball inside a spaceship, there is no way that NASA would ever let us launch something like that onto the International Space Station, let alone have a droid fly around and autonomously service the space station. That is absolutely unthinkable because we just don't have the technology to make that safe. And so in terms of like the things you mentioned, precision navigation, timing, small, delicate control thrusters, the robotics to move and change little things, to do that safely, and to do it robotically without a human in the loop controlling it, that's actually still spooky sci-fi to the human race. We can't do it. And so I think there's probably a decade or more of research in that stuff that I think will help bring it along. But, you know, the real test would be, you know, that NASA would ever let us fly a probe around the space station and not be absolutely deathly afraid of that. So, yeah, there's a lot to come.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. For those sorts of technologies, there's such a huge cost barrier to actually developing and testing and then flying it in space. And we've seen a lot of venture investment over the last decade, but we're also seeing new types of funding come into the sector. Dylan, a question for you. How do you think this will evolve in the coming 10 years, and what sort of funding will we see?
Well, I think you're still going to see nation states as a big client base for sure, but you know, fundamentally, space is challenging to capitalize. There's a few reasons for that. I did a speech recently where I talked about the 4 horsemen of space finance, and I really do think there are 4 key elements that are barriers. One is the time horizon. Oftentimes, you know, most VCs and most funds kind of pencil to a 7-year investment horizon. There are funds that are a bit longer than that, but typically it's 7 years. And most of the business plans that you'll see are, you know, the real payoff is typically, you know, years 7, 8, 9, and 10, kind of the classic hockey stick. So I think that's one issue. Second issue is, by definition, space is pretty illiquid as an asset class. We really don't have any pure play publicly traded space companies, Virgin Galactic accepted. But if you want to invest in space, typically you have to buy a prime, and the primes are involved in a lot of other businesses other than space. So that's the second. Third is most typical investment capital is really focused on IRR, internal rate of return, which is really more of a velocity of capital measurement. And oftentimes, as I said before, the payoffs are really back-end loaded. And then the fourth challenge is most of the business plans in space are capital intensive. And so oftentimes, you know, investors that do want to invest early, typically, unless they're along for the ride and invest at every round, are pretty diluted by the time the real payoffs come. So those are the challenges. So I think, you know, what that lends itself to are longer term capital models. And so, for example, our holding company, we're an operating company. So we're acquiring 51% or greater. And it doesn't necessarily matter if the payoff is next year or 3 years out, because we're owning these things for, you know, for longer term. So I think that's one model. I think one of the challenges we have as an industry, and part of the reason why the economics haven't penciled, is we lack scale. And again, back to what we were talking about earlier, most industries would consolidate with private equity funds and the like, and space is challenged for those kinds of consolidations. So long story short, Jacob, I think we need to be creative with our financing models. If we can get more retail investors involved, and I think that's with publicly traded companies, there's huge retail demand for space, but most people can't write $100,000 or $200,000 angel check. So I think if we can unlock the retail investor, I think that would be another way to help capitalize the industry. So I think we're chipping away at it. But if I had to solve one problem right now, I think the industry really lacks scale. We don't have enough scale in the industry.
Thanks, Dylan. And a lot of the companies we see are typically founder-led that are trying to scale up. Is the main way to scale to become part of a bigger company, or?
Well, hopefully not. I mean, part of what we're trying to do with Voyager is not that, because if you consolidate into a strategic, you get all the benefit of scale, but oftentimes it crushes, no offense to the primes on this call, I'm sorry for this, but it sometimes, not always, crushes the entrepreneurial spirit. And so you want to have your cake and eat it too. If you can bring a founder and say, look, keep doing what you're doing, keep innovating, keep being entrepreneurial, but everything in the back office and everything that scales with size, like capital, finance, administration, public policy, consolidate that. I think those are the kinds of models that oftentimes work best, because consolidating via strategics is certainly one path forward. But my fear is we would stifle some of the innovation that we're seeing in the industry. Part of the reason the industry is so successful, part of the reason we have reusable rockets and we have amazing companies like Peters, is because we have great innovation and great entrepreneurial spirit. So I'd hate to stifle that.
Yeah, it's such a good point. Dylan. Carissa, I know you have invested in a couple of space companies yourself, and you do watch the market as well from a Bryce perspective. What do you think successful new space companies look like, and do you think, to Dylan's point, there are gaps in the market that do need more investment?
I think the market has an almost unlimited capacity to absorb investment. So I would concur. And I'm being a little flip, but I think to Dylan's point, the level of innovation is really extraordinary. Technology innovation and business innovation and investment fuels the business growth from that innovation. I would say that there are three things that I like to see in a space company that really improve its odds of success. First is an incremental plan to generate revenue early, demonstrate success as a business early, and then move into other markets or other aspects of its market or develop new capabilities. Second is targeting existing markets as well as seeking to create a new customer base. One of the significant challenges for space companies is that they often have a two-part problem. We need to persuade people that this is a product they want and then sell them that product, as opposed to compete in an existing market where there's already a customer base and a clear path for competitive success. And third, space companies that succeed generally have a reasonably collaborative relationship with relevant government entities, whether that is regulators, whether that is technology developers, very often whether that is the government as a customer. Those three factors, I think, dramatically increase the likelihood of success of a space company.
Thanks so much, Carissa. And this comes back to your earlier point of how you identify as a company. And when you're looking at your customer base, maybe you want to be an agriculture company when you're providing data to that sector. We're getting a couple of questions through on the chat, so I might turn to a couple of those. And someone's highlighted a couple of the companies that have filed for bankruptcy recently, rather high-profile names there, including OneWeb. Intelsat is wading through their process at the moment as well. Is that a troubling sign for the sector? I might pass to you, Dylan, but I think it'd be good to get everyone's thoughts on this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bankruptcies mentioned in that question are probably companies that were challenged regardless. So oftentimes economic cycles will accelerate directionality. And so I think those companies were likely, I don't want to say they were in a tailspin, but they were in tough shape. And I think this just accelerated that. Where I would get concerned are viable business plans with great teams and good momentum losing escape velocity. Then I would get concerned, but I'm not really seeing that. The capital markets are definitely frozen. I don't think people in the private markets are raising capital in the way they were prior to the economic cycle, but I'm not seeing good companies fail yet. Obviously, if this drags on further, we could see that, but right now I'm not concerned by what I see.
You could go next, Chris.
Yeah, I just learned a new phrase, which is accelerate directionality. And I love that because, I mean, I kind of agree. I don't, from the investment side, there's always this fear that one or two high profile, write-downs will, jeopardize the rest of the investment climate for this industry. And I don't think that's the case with the examples you mentioned, because as Dylan said, there were, to people on the inside, it was fairly well known that there were some structural challenges there, whether it be cost or choices of technology. In the case of OneWeb, largely ignoring the point I made earlier about learning from other industries. There wasn't not a lot of innovation there. It was which made the project expensive. So I think, there was no real surprise to industry insiders there that these companies were in trouble. And I think sophisticated investors have been able to keep up with that news as well. And it hasn't really impacted anything as far as I can tell.
Thanks, Chris. And then, Peter, the number of 120 or 150 launch companies often gets thrown around, but we only see a few companies delivering hardware to space at the moment. As someone running a company, how do you view some of these failures and challenges from an investment perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say that we've enjoyed a long, warm summer, and especially in the small launch industry. And it always ceases to amaze me, the things that small launch vehicle companies that were getting funded, because a lot of them were predicating their business models on hundreds of launches a day against these mega constellations, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to be launching hundreds or thousands of rockets a day to supply a mega constellation. So this was always coming, and our kind of view on it is there's really the market in its current size is large enough to support really two providers, one of them being a large rideshare and one of them being a small dedicated provider. Anything more than that, it becomes there really isn't, the market isn't developed enough at the point yet to service multiple small launch vehicle providers. So for us, it wasn't surprising to see some of that fail. And to Chris's point, some of the technologies were really disruptive enough, and it almost seemed, in some respects, to go the other way. Is that in order to raise any capital, you had to have the next wild, crazy differentiator to be able to be slightly different to somebody else, whether it made good engineering sense or not. So we're not surprised to see there's going to be a pretty brutal consolidation in the small launch market. But at the end of the day, launch is a slave to everybody else. So you need the growth in the satellites and the programs before you can really expect to see a huge amount of growth in launch.
And to add on that, in putting aside the small launch market, because I do think that is, for a number of reasons, aberrant. That large a mismatch between demand and supply. Venture-funded companies, and many of the companies that we're talking about are venture-funded either via venture capital firms or what Dylan called benefactor capital, or what we sometimes call super angel billionaires or advocacy investors. It is more likely than not that a venture-funded company will fail. Not in space, just generally speaking, that is the reality of venture-funded firms. Their venture investors accept a high degree of uncertainty and risk, and the failure rate is significantly greater than the traditional aerospace industry would have ever expected or tolerated or been able to cope with. So it's a really different model, different environment that we're operating in. I think that context is very important too, so that we don't see an overreaction to some failures. Just structurally, they're to be expected.
Thanks so much, Carissa. And I remember your article in the 30 Voices report, and we're talking about how we went through a similar cycle of this with the .com boom. And I quite liked your point that we're not in a .com free world, despite some of the failures that were found at that time. I might pick up another theme that's coming through on the Q&A, and there are a couple of questions around the challenge of investment, depending on where your company or where you're based. And I think all of you as panelists have a link to the US, and we've seen so much investment come from venture funds there. What are the opportunities if you are based in Europe or Australia, and how do you access that, or do you have to make the jump and have a US operation as well? Peter, I might start with you as someone who has made that jump.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak for Australia because I know that there's some really good funds forming there. Certainly in New Zealand, New Zealand's venture capital community is akin of Silicon Valley 20 or 30 years ago, and Australia's been much more successful in that. But my advice is jump. Silicon Valley in America is an amazing place, and it's a place for these kind of opportunities. And although capital is somewhat frozen right now, as we see, especially as you see some more successes in the industry, the capital will probably start to flow again. But I always tell everybody the least valuable asset that an investor gives you is their cash. And having the contacts and the intellectual experiences and horsepower behind solid backer has been more valuable for Rocket Lab than necessarily the cash that that's come with those investments.
Thanks so much, Peter. Chris, you also made the move from Australia to the US and helped set up Planet there. What's your view on?
Yeah, I second what Pete said. I mean, one of the things that makes Silicon Valley work and that makes it hard to replicate is that everybody's here, so they're already here, and both the investors and the entrepreneurs kind of represent a group of people that were willing to kind of get up from their home and leave and go somewhere else to succeed. And that formula, where it's on both sides, both the supply of money and the people who want to take that money, really helps. So if you're in Australia, there's a little bit too much comfort, and the quality of life is really high in Australia, and so there's not as much pressure. Whereas everyone in Silicon Valley, and I've run into very few natives here. Almost probably more than half my friend group, or 70-80%, are either from other states or from overseas. You just really don't run anyone who's local here. Everybody in Silicon Valley came here because they felt that what they could achieve was worth leaving behind their friends, their family, and their lifestyle. And so there's just a higher level of activity and pressure as well, but also just momentum because everyone is pushing behind you here. And it is true in Australia. Some people do that. You can find good investors, you can find good employees, you can start a good company, but I'd say overall it's just slower because there's not that huge tailwind pushing you ahead. And I think that's the really big advantage of being here is just being surrounded by people doing the same thing.
Thanks so much, Chris. And Peter, you made an interesting point before around how we're seeing more venture type funds set up in Australia. Main Sequence and Blackbird are quite actively investing in the space sector. A question for you, Dylan, and then Carissa. Do you focus a lot on the US in your analysis, or do you look further afield and try and see those opportunities as well?
Yeah, speaking for Voyager, we're looking at companies all over the world. So we're actually looking at a company right now in Australia, based in Australia, several in Europe, one in Japan. So we are looking globally. I agree with everything that Peter and Chris said. I think the advantage to being, let's say, European based, just as an example, is there is less competition. So I think you can probably navigate a bit easier in the halls of ESA and some of the other companies because there are just less people, raising their hand saying we can solve this problem. The valuations are definitely lower. I would say it's, at least 40 to 50% lower, the valuations. And so I think it makes, by definition, companies harder to build because your availability capital, not only in terms of the quanta of capital, but how much you're likely to raise given a certain set of circumstances, is lower in Europe as well. And I can't speak to Australia about this, but I know in Europe, just the culture around failure is a bit different. It's changing. I think it is becoming more a badge of honor. You know, and in the U.S., it's, you know, frequently said that a lot of people won't invest in founders who haven't failed before. And there's some wisdom in that, because there's scar tissue you develop when you have a failure that just cannot be replicated and can't be learned, you know, in business school. So I think a lot of this is cultural, where you have to have the environment where it's okay to take risks, because without that, you're not going to get you know, really significant companies coming out the other side of that prism.
Bryce absolutely takes a global perspective. From our clients are global, our clients' interests are global. The global space economy is relevant to American companies and to companies in other countries. I've had the great good fortune of working with a team, establishing a company that had a team in Australia, and drawing on the incredible engineering talent there. Bryce has an arm in the UK, and that's been very interesting to see the different approaches to entrepreneurship and innovation, feet on the ground, boots on the ground. I will say that one of the very interesting global international elements of the space economy right now is the military and intelligence side. The US is increasingly aware of its reliance on space assets, and increasingly concerned about conflict or challenges or threats to those assets, and views its partners and its allies and future space coalitions as critical to its national defense. Europe, the UK, Japan, many countries are increasingly building their ties to one another, thinking about space, military, and intelligence activities, and also enhancing their capabilities in those areas. And I think that that's going to shape the industry in the future, both from the point of view of creating business opportunities and also forming the context in which we all operate.
And Chris, your reports are still well referenced in Australia for the starting of the space agency. So, so your presence here is recognised as well.
We appreciate that.
Chris, another question that's targeted for you through the chat, and just how you evaluate founders and founding teams for investment. Is there a criteria you used, or what are the drivers of that?
Yeah, so I think what I would mostly look for is, I guess, a willingness to take advice, because I think one of the big things that VCs bring to the table is this, you know, the sort of the quality of their advice, not just the money, right? I remember when I was at Planet, one of the really big things we looked for is, you know, there were plenty of companies that wanted to invest, plenty of VCs that wanted to invest in Planet. So we decided that we would look at what other value they could bring, and so we picked investors that had, you know, strategic advice in areas that we really cared about. One for space, one for humanitarian and environmental applications. So that was a VC fund that invested a lot in that sector, and then one that sort of encompassed software and technology. So flipping to the other side, I would want to see entrepreneurs that were open to that and were like, how can you help us? Money's great, but I can get that anywhere. Will you be a good board member? Will you help us, you know, drive this company? And if the entrepreneur is open to that, I'd say that's a really good sign. Probably the biggest one.
Thanks, Chris. I might pass to you, Dylan, and building on that, there's a question around how you balance the different types of funding that you can get, and the time taken to seek VC funding versus the time taken to build a proposal for a grant, or we see a lot of grants in Australia. I think the SBIR program in the US is quite popular, but how do you balance that?
Well, that's a great question. I typically advise founders, you know, when I'm mentoring leaders and founders, I tell them to be very, very, very stingy with their equity externally and very generous internally. And normally people do the exact opposite. You know, they'll say, well, equity is a cheap form of capital. And of course, the exact opposite is the case. It's the most expensive capital you'll ever raise, especially at the early stages. And, you know, to me, it's an exercise in de-risking your business plan. So if you can bootstrap your company, if you can get SIBRs and other government contracts, build your team, show revenue, show traction before you actually have to start taking dilutive capital, I think that's a good model. It might be a slightly slower, but I can't tell you how many exits I've seen, not only in space, but outside of space, where the founders had an exit and the founders didn't get much, because by the time the waterfall was, you know, divvied out, there wasn't a lot left for the early investors. So I think it's really important, and it goes back to what Chris said, get good advice, whether it's the VC who might, you know, be an early investor, or just people you put on your advisory board. But just, I think that's the number one lesson I would, you know, try to communicate to folks. There's a lot of really good, experienced people out there, but you have to seek them out, and then you need to listen to what they have to say.
It's such good advice. And do you think, I know we sort of touched on the slowdown of investment. Do you think that that will pick up again once lockdowns ease and markets free up? Do you think we'll return to the sorts of investment we were seeing last year?
I do. I don't know when. I think the biggest challenge we have right now is nobody really knows where value is. The public markets seem to think value is right back to where it started. I can't explain that. It's a head scratcher for me. But I think most people in the private markets know that there's a pretty deep discount to where we were, because values were pretty inflated, frankly, before. But whether that value is 30% lower or 20% lower, I think that's where the market's trying to reprice. And the problem with the private markets is there's just not enough data points. You know, it's not like a publicly traded security where you can see it repriced in real time. So I think once we have repricing, then I think that we'll have some unthawing in the capital markets. But right now it's pretty, I would say it's not frozen, but it's pretty, it's, you know, it's definitely not nearly the level of activity that we had 6 months ago, for sure.
Thanks, Dylan. Chris, did you have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that important things are still getting funded, and VC is interesting because if you look at the public markets, we're very early stage, right? We have a bunch of cash sitting in a fund, and we need to allocate it to things that take possibly years to, you know, become real businesses and then finally maybe list on the stock market. So that process has to keep going at some point. And so we're still investing, but I think COVID has made us all think that maybe the things we put our money into should be more carefully chosen. And so I would guess that in the industry at large, some of the more frivolous things are not getting funded. You know, maybe as Pete said much earlier in the call, you know, there are some companies that maybe the technologies they've borrowed are potentially not credible. And I think some of those ones will not be seeing more money. But at the end of the day, space is so vital to our infrastructure, to our way of life, to our communications, our healthcare infrastructure, and, you know, almost every aspect of you know, modern human activity is touched by space, that investment has to keep going. And I think there's a lot of really important applications that still need to be funded. So I think taking on a sort of view of like, how do we make the world better? And COVID was a great wake-up call to take other things more seriously. Threats such as pandemics, climate change, you know, energy crises, those things are still really important, and they still need investment, and so we're still doing it.
Thanks so much, Chris. And the applications are really boundless there. Peter, I know recently you've been working on a new satellite platform. How do companies beyond the space sector, and it gets back to some of our earlier discussion about space identity again, but if you really have nothing to do with the space sector but think, hey, there's an interesting data point I could use, where do you start?
Yeah, well, that's precisely what we're trying to do, right? Is that it shouldn't take 2 years and $20 million to put an idea in orbit. And we kind of see launch as a solved problem now. And then the next big barrier to getting ideas and innovation in orbit is having to form spacecraft teams and have a whole lot of guys in white jackets roaming around to be able to put an idea on orbit. So, the next step that we're trying to democratize really is exactly that. So, building a satellite platform where people can come with their sensor, can come with even their idea, and it's really turnkey from start to finish, so that there doesn't need to be such heavy investment. And look, we see it all the time, right? Where a startup will raise a bunch of money, build a spacecraft, put it on orbit, and something doesn't work. Sometimes even something silly doesn't work, and it's a massive penalty to be able to try and do that again, especially if you just want to try something. So what we're trying to do is make a platform where, think of it like a sandbox in Leo, where it's just incredibly cheap and ubiquitous, that it's so easy to put sensors and ideas in orbit that you can take a lot of that capital and risk out of trying new business ideas.
Thanks so much, Peter. Carissa, do you have any other thoughts on how companies beyond the space sector start to engage, or do they need to engage?
If there's going to be a LEO economy beyond a government-funded LEO economy, other than satellites, absolutely, companies outside of space need to engage, because we still are seeking manufacturing opportunities at scale, and so pharmaceutical opportunities at scale. And the solution to that, to Peter's point, if you're trying to find truly innovative applications for microgravity that generate biomedical benefits, the way to do that is not to select one company, engage with it for 2 years, have it invest several $1 million, and then sequentially move on to the next one, if nothing. The way to do that is to engage at scale with many, many companies in that sector and have them be able to enter the marketplace, enter the experience in bite size, in small steps, so that their researchers think about what they can do with microgravity, so they get experience doing that. And that will drive the intellectual innovation that will lead to those applications. So absolutely, it's critical for companies outside the space industry to be able to participate. And that has to mean a very minimal commitment in order to do it, or they won't. So I think, and I also love Sandbox and Leo. Peter, I hope you have that on your business cards. It's very evocative and exactly right.
Thanks so much, Carissa. So today we've really spoken about the investment in these space companies. We've spoken about how companies outside of the sector can enter space and benefit from space. But really, as a closing round of questions, I just want to ask, what do you think the most exciting benefit is to our day-to-day lives as citizens and people? So, Chris, I might get you to kick us off.
You said me, right?
Sure did. Over to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, which, shouldn't be forgotten, that one of the biggest powers of space is just to inspire people. And a lot of what the industry actually does is buried well, not underground, I guess, but in space and out of sight. But the connection to what we do on Earth, particularly through things like Planet and the fantastic launches you see out of Rocket Lab in New Zealand, and out of Pete's beautiful launch site, those things can have a really powerful impact on people. And I still think that's the ability to inspire humans and help us connect to our home. That's probably for me always the biggest.
Thanks, Chris. Over to you, Dylan.
I totally agree with Chris. I mean, the reason I love space and I'm so passionate about it is really for the social change aspect of it. I think it's fundamentally it's a tool for transformation, I believe. So I'm definitely in that social camp. And I think, a lot of the problems we have that are intractable, I think is due to the fact that we lack perspective in a lot of cases. So I definitely am in that camp. On the technical side, I mean, the one thing I'm fascinated by, and there's a lot of people who think this is a pipe dream, but if Starship works, which Elon's track record's pretty good, we could get point-to-point terrestrial travel. I think that is practical. That would be a game changer, and that would make the world much closer if you could go, let's say Sydney to New York in 12 minutes or whatever it would be. So that would be my answer. That would be a game changer for me.
Thanks, Dylan. Peter, what's the most exciting benefit of space to our lives for you?
Well, I think the other panelists have said it really well. Is in space is hidden infrastructure. If you brought everything down on orbit and stuck it along the streets, everybody would walk past it in awe because they're just fantastically beautiful machines. But it's all hidden infrastructure. It's kind of, you go to your sink in your house and turn on the tap and water comes out. But there's a huge amount of infrastructure behind that water flowing that you never either see. And the same as in space. But it just like water, space is taken for granted as we communicate, as we use GPS, all these things. And Rocket Lab's mission is really to use space to improve life on Earth, and that's what gets me up every morning and it gets me incredibly excited. Is space is the one domain where you can put up a piece of infrastructure, and if we talk about it just as infrastructure, that can literally have an effect. That one little box of electronics can have an effect to millions and millions of people's lives. I mean, we put up some weather satellites a couple of years ago that provide weather data to New Zealand, Australia, UK, America. Just one little box of electronics is transforming a number of people's lives and decisions. And I think that's the power of space, and the thing that gets me really, really excited is how much of an impact you can have down here on Earth with such a relatively small, at least by mass, set of infrastructure. It's crazy.
Thanks, Peter. Tough list of answers to follow, Carissa, but I'll get you to close it out.
Much as I love the inspirational aspects of space, and boy, do they speak to me personally, speak to me and so many people. I have to say that I'm an analyst. That defines me. I like to figure things out. And the tools that space infrastructure and assets and capabilities give us to know about the cosmos, to know about our world, to know about what's going on next door, to communicate, to learn, those tools are extraordinary. So I would say that for me, the most exciting thing about space is what it lets us know.
What a great answer to finish on, and I'm sure the couple of hundred people we have on the call will join me in thanking all of you for what has been a truly fascinating panel. So Carissa, Chris, Dylan, Peter, thanks for taking time out of your very busy days to join us today.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you
really
so
fun.
much. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, no, thanks very much.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you.
Cheers.
And April and the team at AmCham, thank you again for hosting this series. This was episode 2. We've got 3 more to come. So next week we're talking about human spaceflight next Thursday, same time, Sydney time, and then space data the week after, and we'll close it out with what future holds for space sustainability in 3 weeks' time. So thank you all for joining, and look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Thank you all.